Hello and welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me on another of my amazing interviews. Today I want to explore, with the help of my guest, something that is actually going to happen to everybody at some point. Hopefully not too soon, but we've all got to face it, and that is the afterlife. Have you thought about it? Does it frighten you? Are you scared of it, or is this a subject that you tuck away in a drawer that you think, actually, I never really want to have a look at until the moment comes? Well, maybe it's not as scary as perhaps some people think. Maybe some people are at that point where they're looking forward to it. I know when my parents passed over, they were pretty much looking forward to shedding this mortal coil, if you like, and going on to the next stage. So my guest today is Charlie Efford. He has been an army engineer. He's been a management consultant. He coaches people, and he is a trained counsellor. And he's spent a lot of time normalising the paranormal. Charlie, welcome to the show. It's very lovely to have you on the show to talk about this very personal, I suppose, subject that everybody will at some point face. And hopefully you're going to be taking away the fear of the afterlife for us.
Well, Richard, thank you for asking me. It's a pleasure to be here. I really enjoy sharing information, and this is a subject that, as you say, everyone's going to face at some point. And the stuff I've gleaned, and I'm going to give a little health warning here that this is not the truth. This is just my truth and the things that make sense to me. And I'm aware lots of people out there have their own views. So I'm offering it in that spirit of this is my view, and if it helps, it does, and if it doesn't, then that's fine too.
Yeah.
Um, so what I really want to do is to share some of the information that makes sense to me, as you say, to take away some of the fear and to also, I think, speed people's process, I suspect, through the next stages of the afterlife.
Okay. Well, that sounds very good. I mean, we've gone through a period of fear with the recent pandemic. People have also witnessed friends and relations who have passed on, or they may be facing it, because they're getting old and they know that they've got, the clock is ticking, as it were. So I think this is a particularly relevant subject to be looking at. So it's entirely over to you, Charlie.
Right. Well, in general terms, I know death can seem to be accidental, or sometimes if people are murdered or seriously hurt and they die, it can look as though it's happening to you. But from what I've gleaned, the actual moment of death is always something that's chosen by the soul.
Right.
And when I say the
Okay.
soul, I'm talking about that energetic part that we all have, which is the higher self, the part of us that's got access to a much broader range of information and awareness of why we're here than most of us have in our kind of daily lives.
Right. So I mean, when you say, people get murdered or they have an accident, presumably then the soul or the higher self knows that's going to happen.
That's what I can gather.
Right.
And even sometimes, people can die quite early in life. Sometimes, children die quite young. And what I've seen from a lot of people's perspectives is that to say if there's a benevolent God that this child should die at a young age feels really harsh.
Mm.
And sometimes it seems that some souls volunteer to leave the world fairly early. And it's often about giving the parents an experience of grief so that in another life they've got a deep understanding of that, what that grief really means, and then they're able to help other people. So it's a bit like it's about changing perspective. So if somebody was grumpy to you in the car park, in a say Tesco's, and they sort of get out of my way and they push the trolley past you, it'd be tempting to say, "What a rude man! How awful he is."
Yes.
But if you'd found out that this man's wife had died that morning and he was really upset and hadn't got much clue, you might look at him a bit more kindly.
Yes.
And if you knew that his wife had agreed to leave the world early to give him an experience of grief so that he could do something in the next life, it might have a different understanding, further. So a lot of these things for me are about standing and wondering. So, as an example, if I see someone begging in the street or selling the big issue, before I dive in and want to save them and rescue them and hand over money, and I do sometimes, a little part of me just stops and says, I wonder what whereabouts are they on their life path? What are they doing here? What do they really need from me? What can I do that's going to help them, rather than just automatically sticking out a helping hand? And sometimes I walk past, and sometimes I help. It's just a gut instinct, really. So if I bring it back, we're all here for a purpose. We've all got things to, um, I prefer to say, to experience and understand rather than learn. I think learning implies that someone's setting you a test somewhere, and I'm not sure that necessarily the case.
Yes.
There's no sort of big teacher in the sky. Um, and our exit from this world seems to be something that is chosen, and sometimes it's chosen because it's planned. I think sometimes the soul kind of gets bored when it realizes that the individual is not listening to the higher self, that all the guidance that's being sent down is being ignored, and there really is no point in carrying on the experiment. So the soul will find some way to exit.
Oh, that's really, and that, I mean, that's really interesting. So it's the. Could you explain how you see then the higher self and the soul? Are they separate entities or part of an entity, but like a different department, as it were, in a business? That the accounts department are unhappy with the marketing department, and so they ditch the marketing department and find another one.
Yeah. So from what I can gather, I talk about source as being the sort of divine, the creator God. There's lots of different
Yeah.
words people use. Um, Little splinters of source energy seem to be cast out, and I think those splinters are we call a soul. And then what I think happens is the soul, in a kind of parallel process, casts out little splinters, which become the life souls or the higher selves that we've all got powering us up at the moment. And without that, so the higher self would be the a splinter of the soul, and the soul will be a splinter of source energy, if that makes sense.
Right.
In other words, the bit that's powering us up now is like a little hologram of our soul, but it's not the full amount of energy. And it's certainly in our current state of being, we haven't got access to all the information about all the other lives that our soul has chosen to lead, which is a big assault on the ego, I think.
Well, yes, I guess yes, that's true.
Because
So
sorry.
no, well, I was going to say then that if our higher self is saying, right, okay, it's time to eject this one and go somewhere else, presumably it's chosen us when we're born.
Yeah, this is where there's a guy called Michael Newton who wrote a series of books. The headline title is Journey of Souls, and he presented a picture that when we come to choose another life, we get some choice. So I think that choice is dependent on what whereabouts in the curriculum, the soul curriculum, we happen to have got to. So what kind of experiences do we need to have? Excuse me. Um, we then seem to it's like choosing a part in a play. We can put on different clothes and act in a certain way. So we might choose to be born in April because we want to be fiery and a leader like an Aries person is. So it kind of turns astrology around. Funnily enough, it makes it if you want those characters, well, be born in April because then you're going to get them.
Right.
And I think there's quite a bit of complexity there. There's lots of different layers, but we kind of choose these layers quite specifically and quite carefully. And then there seems to be a process of choosing a suitable body, if you like, a physical body for us to join with so that we can live out that life. And in that process, it seems that we set up certain situations, we form agreements with other souls who are going to incarnate around the same time as us. And so when we drop into this earth, we're dropping in with a sort of set of goals, a life purpose, if you like. Um, we're also dropping in with a set of agreements to help other people with their life purposes. And I think some people, maybe not everybody, has got something to do for the greater good or the planet. It could be anything from, coming up with an invention to looking after animals to, just doing counselling. There's lots of things people can do for their greater good.
Mm. Um,
So kind of
so,
three parts, yeah.
yeah, no, I was going to say it would be useful if we, in our ordinary everyday sort of self, had some awareness of that. And I suppose that's what people do when they meditate, and they try to connect, or they channel, whatever term it is, to, there's that. I mean, clearly there's a quest that most people wonder what happens once we die, where we've come from, is this it? Is there more to life? And perhaps some take that more seriously and go investigating it, and for others it's just perhaps a whim or a chat in the pub, and then it's back to the mundaneness of life. That wasn't a question; that was just a statement, of course. So let's go back to the moment of death then, and what happens with the afterlife. Tell us a bit more about that process.
Okay. So to set that up, it seems as though we have different layers of energy body, including our physical body. So there seems to be sort of five main bits. So the first one is our physical body. And then beyond that, there's something that most people would call an etheric body. It's a less dense version of ourselves. It looks like us, but it just hasn't got the materialness. And beyond that, there seems to be an emotional body, a mental body, which is about our mind. And then finally, we've got the higher self, or the soul splinter. So at the moment of death, it seems as though the soul has made a choice that it's time to go. And it, according to Alice Bates Bailey, it gives out the word, a sound, I suspect. And at that moment, the physical body starts to react. So it seems that it triggers the brain to send a chemical around the body, which will stop the heart. Um, and if I talk about acupuncture, and acupuncture is about putting needles into the nerve pressure points, acupuncture points around the body. Those seem to correspond with similar connections into the etheric body. And in the Far East, they call them nadis. Anyway, there's a kind of vibration set up, and those nadis all get broken and disconnected. At the same time, we've got two chords which are going to give us life and consciousness. So we've got one coming in through the head, which is the consciousness cord, and that seems to disconnect fairly frequently, often at night when we dream. But the life cord, it's a bit like having a sort of power lead to be plugged in. Seems primarily to be centered at the heart. Some of it comes in through the spleen and some comes through the head, but the heart seems to be where it resides. So when that cord gets unplugged or severed, at that point, the body, which has its own consciousness, it's like pulling the lead out of the computer. The computer's great, but if you turn the power off, it doesn't work very well. So the body stops working at this point. There's a kind of pull going on. So there's the pull of the soul to extract the etheric body, disconnect it from the physical body. And in the opposite direction, there's a pull of the earth to attract the physical body back into the elemental pool, and to return the body through decay and decomposition back into the energy pool. And sometimes that pull can be so strong that people don't quite manage to divest themselves of their etheric body. There's a kind of a sort of tussle going on. But let's assume that it is disconnected. So at that moment, people often report that they walk around for 2 or 3 days after they died, and they have their full consciousness, they have their full awareness of who they are and what they've done. They can see, they can hear. Of course, what they can't do is touch. And it gets a bit confusing, and some people don't even realize they've died at this point.
Oh, right.
They're not ghosts at this stage. It's just a kind of an etheric version of themselves that hasn't got a physical body to communicate with. Sometimes they seem to be able to sort of, glow a candle out, or maybe knock something, or there's often an electromagnetic pulse. When my dad died in the late 90s, there was a kind of ripple of power through the house, and my wife at the time's hairdryer fused on and wouldn't turn off. My car had one of those radios that you had to code if you pulled it out,
Yes.
and I hadn't pulled it out. And when I came back into the car, it needed coding again, and a headlamp bulb had blown. So there's like a sort of power surge went through the house at this point. Um, so people can hang around then for a few days. They often attend their own funerals and the sort of so in lots of ancient traditions, like shamans and sort of maybe the priests, there's often a kind of process of um, talking to the person who's just died as though they're still there. Nurses often do this when people die in hospital, and really helping them to understand that they're ready for the next stage of the process and that they can move on. Um, at this stage, when they are ready to move on, then there seems to be a process of going through a tunnel of light. Um, People are often met by their guides or their loved ones. Quite often, guides will appear in the guise of loved ones because they want to not frighten people, they want to make them feel comfortable, they want to help them. There's a really strong sense of love and care and nurture at this stage in the process. Um, and then people later on will get to a stage where the emotional body and the mental body need to be integrated and collapse into the etheric body. So they kind of form a unified energy field, if you like. Um, and I think what happens then is that we all seem to go on some kind of journey because people expect to go on a journey. Sometimes it's a boat, sometimes it's a plane, sometimes it's in a space station. Um, I did a regression session with one of Michael Newton's trainees, and my experience was of a bit like in the film Finding Nemo when they got caught in the Gulf Stream. They were all being drifting along in this big stream, having a nice chat, and I was in this sort of dark space, and all I could see were these lights all going in the same direction. And it was very comfortable and warm. I was just being sort of dragged along and drawn. Um, anyway, eventually we get to a destination, and at this destination, there's a kind of bit of a healing goes on to remove some of the initial rough edges of the life we've just led. And then there's a period of what I can gather, um, adjustment, probably the best way of putting it. So it's about us getting used to not having a physical body. I think in that world, the physics are very different. So manifestation becomes instant. So learning to control our thoughts becomes very important. You sort of, people that talk about, being careful what you wish for. Well, maybe in that world, you've really got to be careful what you wish for.
Right.
Um, and then the interesting thing is, because we can create in this world anything we want. So if we want to be in a fishing lodge, we can create a fishing lodge. If we want to be in the mountains, we can create the mountains. But initially, people tend to be drawn energetically. So there's no kind of segregation and punishment. It's simply a sort of physical attraction process to a vibrational world that matches how they've just left their current life. And what doesn't seem to happen at this point is any great enlightenment. So if you're a complete bozo when you leave the earth, you're probably a complete bozo when you get into the spirit world for a while. So just because someone's died doesn't mean to say that if you get a medium to connect with them, they can really impart any great wisdom because they probably can't. Um, so people who are, as an example, who are quarrelsome and gossipy and a bit sort of sharp around the edges will find themselves with lots of other people in the same kind of vein, really. And they kind of look around and think, this is a bit strange. Why do I want to do this? But eventually they get tired of it. And at that point, when they realize there's something that they could move out of this way of being, then the guides have something to work with and can start to help them adjust and move on. So the advanced souls tend to go through this stage pretty quickly. If sometimes they skip it altogether. The majority of people, the sort of, the middle-aged souls, if you like, tend to need a little bit of period to kind of rest, recuperate, adjust, and kind of realize that it's time to move on and time to start the healing process. And when I say healing process, I don't mean sort of physically putting plasters on
Mm.
or giving pills. It's healing is really a way of raising our vibration, and we can do that by letting go of the sharp emotional edges that have held us back, by accepting who we are, um, and kind of coming to terms and understanding what's happened, so that those feelings of maybe hate or resentment or wishful thinking, all of those kind of get put into a context and become far less potent, so we can actually elevate ourselves and move on.
So can I ask? I mean, you've been very. It's almost as if that's all kind of laid out in your mind on the process. Where has this idea, as it were, come from? How do you what gives you that theory?
I've probably read about 20 or 30 books on the subject. And I'm very happy to sort of share the titles that I think would be useful to read later on. But some of the ones that have made the most impression on me would be, Michael Newton's Journey of Souls is where I started. Um, then I came across Death, the Great Adventure,
Ah, right.
which is an Alice Bailey book. Not a very thick book, but some quite deep. It's a kind of book that I can read about 5 or 6 pages in a row. Then I need to stop and digest what I've just. It's like
Right. Yes.
rich chocolate cake. You can't have much.
No.
There's a whole bunch of out here called the Joseph Communications. I think people see that. Um, Life after death. Um, there are lots of groups out there, and what they do is there's a medium, and he'll channel an entity, and the entity is not necessarily a specific soul, but tends to be the voice piece of a collective group of souls.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I've been with my brother doing this. His entity is called Bernard or Bernard, um, and I've been involved in these question and answer sessions where you can ask questions like, one guy said, "Can you reincarnate as a dog?" And so Bernard went, "Oh, "Yes, of course you can, but why would you?"
Yes.
Um, and obviously, these mediums are exploring, slightly more interesting questions than that, going into it. So they've documented a lot of their work, and what I've done is read it and then, digested it and tried to make sense and drawn the parallels of the things that may be being expressed in different words, but are actually saying the same kind of thing.
Right. Yes.
So the only experience I've had was that the regression I did with one of Michael Newton's trainees. I got taken back to a previous life. I was a Victorian, very rich Victorian gentleman. And when I died, I was lying in this bed with a kind of Scrooge type nightcap on. And there were the family sort of weeping and wailing around the bed. And I remember rising up to the ceiling and looking down on them and going, "Oh, for Christ's sake." And just going off and leaving them to it. So I don't know. I think I was anyway.
It's interesting you say that because many years ago I used to practice hypnosis. My dad taught me some hypnosis. He used to do it in the RAF when he was, I think, part of his national training. Not that they taught him how to do it, but he would do it with some of the other blokes. He was interested in similar things and read all these books. Anyway, he tried to hypnotize me, but it never worked because I was too busy analyzing what he was saying and thinking, "Oh, am I supposed to be in this state now?" And not quite there. But I used to do it to other people. I mean, I was in my mid-20s then, and I read a book about regression, and I found this guy who did go into his art, because I would tentatively, with most people, sort of just take them back before birth and see if they remembered anything. And some people would just say, "No, it's very black, I can't remember anything," and so I wouldn't linger. But this one particular chap, he would go back, and I had no reason to doubt that he was sincere in himself. Whether any of it was true or not, I couldn't possibly say, but at one point he was, I mean, it was, it does seem kind of laughable now. At one point he was a Roman centurion, which you might think anybody could just pull that out of the ether. But another one, he was a Frenchman, and he did start to talk in French. And I asked him when I brought him back if he did much French at school and things like that, and he said he just did 1 year's French, very preliminary. And I regret really that I didn't then start to do research and make proper notes, and sort of go, okay, these things you see, because I would say, oh, I can't remember if I recorded it. I may have recorded it on an old cassette back then. But he was adamant that he didn't know French. He had no idea what he was saying. He couldn't really remember a great deal. But I remember that he was pretty fluent in the use of his French. Unfortunately, I don't speak French myself, so I hadn't a clue what he was saying. But it was, I guess I moved away from that because it was a bit, I was out of my depth a bit. I could make people do a bit of post-hypnotic suggestion stuff and, make cigarettes taste horrible and take pain away in arms and things. But I thought I better leave the regression stuff alone just in case it is affecting them, because I was, pretty naive, really. So it's interesting you speak about your experience. Do you still now feel that connection? Do you feel, because you've gone back in time to that moment, that it was a real thing, or was it more dreamlike?
It's a little bit dreamlike, but I can recognize I didn't dwell in that life very long. I probably have some kind of reading every 2 or 3 years. And I'm less interested in having someone tell me that I've got my granddad here, and was he a man with a beard, and did he drink tobacco? And
Yeah.
I'm more curious about any kind of insight they can give me. So there are essences of that life that resonate, and that's probably the closest I can get to having any association with it.
Because it does seem that children make observations about possible previous lives, and then by the age of about 7 or 8, it's those things have gone. And I think people are, they're quite interested in that. But because children are unable to fully express themselves in a more adult fashion, it's very difficult to know.
It is, and that kind of thing to me opens up the subject of reincarnation. And I've got two versions that I'd like to just share. So the standard version is that we finish this life, we go through a process of, healing and having some sort of life review for the life we've just led, and then eventually, when we've done that, we get round to choosing another life, and we're going to get nudged to come back to the earth and go on to the next class in the curriculum. And that's kind of where I was until about 2 or 3 years ago. I'd worked out throughout that process that if I've lived lots of lives, then every time I come back, I'm not coming back as, Charlie in a slightly different time zone. I'm coming back as a completely different person. And therefore, the sense of self that I have at the moment must disappear at some point so that I can have another self.
Yes.
So I found that a little bit interesting to sort of ponder and be curious about. However, I then read another book. I'm just going to bring this one up on the screen as well, Richard, if I can.
Yeah, no, please do.
Called Wheels of Change.
Wheels of Creation. Yeah.
It's by a guy called E.M. Nicolai and H.L. Jang or Yang. There's about 6 of these books in a series. This is the 6th one. And they propose a very different, or an alternative view to that. So what they would suggest is each time that we finish a life, that the soul splinter, the higher self, if you like, would ideally find its way back to the soul. And as part of that journey, it would become aware of all the other lives that the soul has led. And so there'd be a sense of unity and oneness with the soul. But the individuality of that life would never be lost. I think that's the same when we eventually find our way back to source energy. The individuality that we retain doesn't get lost, but we gain connection. an awareness of connection. So I think oneness means that rather than we just become one with everything and completely merge and lose ourselves completely. Um, so he suggests the soul would cast out wheels of lives, and each wheel would have a theme, and there might be 8 to maybe 12 lives on a wheel. And so when we have past life regression work, and when children remember, it could be because they are connecting to the other lives on that wheel, because those are the ones they're most closely associated with. That makes sense.
Yes.
So rather than being a past life, they become another life.
Right. Yeah.
It seems that when we're young, the little veil between our awareness of those and what's going on is fairly thin, so this information can leak through.
Oh, I see. So yes.
So rather than a constant recycling, there's a kind of spraying out that everything then eventually finds its way back again.
So are you saying that we retain a certain, I don't want to use the word ego, but a certain self knowledge of ourselves as we continue? If we're not going back to so if we're not like drops of water in a great ocean, that we go back into the ocean and then we become part of the ocean and we're all one ocean and not drops anymore, are we retaining ourselves like these drops in rainfall, that as we fall, I'm thinking on my feet here, as we go to different heights, as it were, as if you're rain and you're falling from 10,000 feet to 9,000 feet, during that process, that same raindrop is now somebody else or something else or whatever, but you're still the same raindrop, rather than going into the sea where you just merge into everything.
That's my understanding. And with all of this stuff, I don't know what the answers are yet because I haven't.
No, haven't been there.
I'm sure I have done before, but
you
not
have
this time.
done, but that's right. Yeah.
So for me, when I read these books, if it resonates and I think, actually, yeah, I get that. That makes sense. For me, it's more like a sense of remembering rather than learning.
Mm.
So if it resonates, like, right, yes, I remember. And this one does feel as though it's got some legs. Um, so that sense of retaining our individual identity and that whole sort of packet of information doesn't seem to disappear. And I think what we do is add to it. What we add to it is the connection and our awareness of our connection to everything else in the universe at the same time. And initially through our soul and all the other lives, and then down here it would be about connecting with nature. And as you go higher up the tree, then that awareness sort of expands and expands and expands, and we feel part of everything. But it would be like I suppose, an atom or a molecule in our body. It still exists as a separate, but it makes up a whole of us.
Right. So are we becoming more emphatic, having more empathy as we regenerate, as you like? So in other words, we're quite self-centered, and the universe is, or the world is, all about us in our initial beginning, and then as we go through these different lives, we're becoming much more open, I suppose, to all sorts of people's problems, and we can understand and have more empathy with one another because we've effectively experienced it.
I think that's right. I think when we're cast out, we seem to pick up two basic orientations when we sort of leave the source energy. The first one is a sort of soul archetype. There seem to be 7 options we can choose from, and these be things like being a priest or a warrior or a helper and things like that. I'm apparently a scholar, and I sit somewhere in the middle of the range. My job is to sort of collect information and share it. So I've got that tendency in me, and I can recognize that now. I wouldn't have done 30 years ago, but I can now.
Right.
The other orientation is whether we are choosing to be a service to self soul or a service to others soul. So that's my doorbell going in the background. The service to self souls tend to be hive souls, and they're not, one isn't better than the other, they're just different. And they tend to be about learning from the basis of the whole group. So each one of them, so it's a bit like a hive of worker bees, they're all working in service of the group. And providing the group thrives, they can all benefit from the group knowledge. Service to others, which is what most human beings are, is where we progress as an individual soul and we gain our experience, if you like, by serving other people. Um, so on this earth at the moment, we have a body which is designed for a service to others' soul orientation, so human angelic soul. And when our service to self soul drops into it, and it does happen, they haven't got all the plugs and the wires to connect into the, especially the emotional bodies that we carry. And they seem very selfish. They're probably the psychopaths and the sociopath in society. And there seems to be some kind of, alien bio invasion. I'm saying that sort of with a little bit of care, but I think it's quite normal for souls from other races in the universe to want to incarnate on the earth for lots of good reasons, as well as maybe some not so good ones. But in the process, when they pick up a body, it'd be like someone in the UK driving, a right-hand drive car and suddenly being thrust into a left-hand drive car. It gets a bit strange at first, and you have to learn how to
Right.
work with it.
Yeah.
And I think they struggle. So I've lost the original question in my mind now, but that was something about souls and where we're coming from.
So it's interesting you talk about other entities from different parts of the universe. I mean, I was just wondering whether, uh, because we are human, or this is the form that we take and we call it human, whether there are other entities in the universe, or whether actually, the thing that we so much seems to be an illusion in a way. I mean, you hear people saying that we are spiritual beings having a physical life. And I wonder if, and other people are saying that everything that you see, thanks to quantum physics and stuff, is just vibrations that are created through your own mind, although we clearly share those things. Otherwise, people wouldn't be able to get on the same bus. But you mentioned other entities from different planets or the universe. So I'm just wondering whether what we see as a universe with the solar system and planets and things, does that exist in the same way for other beings, or is that just our vision that we see and interpret?
You know what? I haven't got a clue to that answer. Question. Um,
Good. Well, I'm glad I pinned you down on that one.
my guess would be that energetically, I think the two statements you gave seem to be very sensible to me. We are. I think I see myself as a spiritual being at essence, having a human experience for very good reasons, and I think this idea of creating the material world around us is an illusory one. There seems to be a lot of space when you look at it a bit more closely. Um, so energetically, if we are designed as human angelic souls, and I think we have been designed. I think the creationists and the evolutionists have both got something to add to the picture. I don't think either one has got the whole picture. Um, then why couldn't there be other species? If God's wanting to express him herself, not sure what the right words are, in lots of different ways, why wouldn't other species be created that have got different variations and different ideas and ways of doing things? So they've got the Palladians and the Syrians and the Arcturians and the Draconians, and people talk about the reptiles and the Anunnaki. There's so many different, the Hathors. I could probably go on, but
Mm.
all of these beings seem to be at different levels of evolvement as a species, having different experiences, and sometimes they seem to, want to come to Earth either to help. So I think they come in two ways. They can either come in their own form. I suspect, as you can see from the NASA files at the moment, that they're starting to reveal a lot more about the contact that we've had with, galactic beings in the past. Um, I also think that those galactic souls, which aren't necessarily human angelic souls, can choose, as we can choose in reverse, to incarnate in a human body. And I think that's
Right.
as
I
well.
was going to ask you, when you were talking about these other souls, are they in physical form, or are they in an ethereal form that people are channeling rather than actually physically touching and shaking hands with, assuming they have hands?
I would suspect both.
Right.
I mean, it does seem to be a real thing that there are galactic souls from other parts of the galaxy working with a human body. Some can do it quite well, some really struggle. Um, there's then the whole idea, and I'm not sure, I don't know a huge amount of this, but the idea that there are this reptilian race. I'd always feel a bit strange saying that because I can't imagine a crocodile sort of floating around controlling anything. But anyway, but assuming they've got reptilian type characteristics, they do seem to be deliberately choosing to incarnate as human beings, and that they seem to have got the lowdown on incarnating into the powerful roles, the powerful families, and that from that position they've got a very different agenda to the human angelic soul agenda. Um,
And if they've got this so-called power, um, it seems that they're very patient if they're trying to take over the world and control things, as this is an area that I've been sort of questioning and pushing on the channel to try and elicit some response to see if that's what's going on, and it does seem to be. They seem to not be as well. They're very powerful with manipulation of populations and getting people to choose things, but they're not clearly not able to sort of snap their fingers and magic happens, as in a Disney film. I wonder why that would be.
um,
Or are they all or are we all constrained to some physical, what would you call it, physical science, I suppose, the physical elements that we've all got to suffer, gravity and various oxygens and gases, and we're all in this swimming mass of the quantum vibrations of things moving, and perhaps they move better than us or less good, whichever entity it is. It's just humans seem to have adapted very well to be able to do that, it would seem, but perhaps not well enough.
Okay, this is where I've tried to sort of elevate my understanding to try and make sense of it. So rather than talking about these terrible aliens who are here to conquer the world and enslave us and make life really awful for us, I can perhaps draw a parallel between maybe the British and a couple of hundred years ago and the Spanish and the French, seeking out to create empires. Um, we landed on foreign shores and imposed our values and imposed our way of life, and maybe there's some good things that came out of it, but essentially we were looking to create a space and sort of conquer, I suppose, for all kinds of reasons, usually trade. So why wouldn't another galactic race want to do something similar? Why wouldn't they see the Earth as another territory that they could expand and use? And why wouldn't they then try to set up systems and ways of living which suited them rather than suited us?
It's a very, but is that not a very humanistic storytelling type of approach?
Probably.
Um,
I don't know.
Because I mean, I know I mean, because we're obviously humans and we live this way. I mean, this is why sometimes when I hear these things and I think to myself, but that's because we're humans. We perceive it that way. Maybe in if there are other galaxies and things, perhaps trade and all of that is not even a thing. That I don't know. And maybe we're sort of going into too much speculation anyway.
Probably.
But there seems to be at the moment a lot of interest, talk, certainly YouTube videos talking about things like ascension, revelations. There seems to be a lot of spiritual conversation going on now. Why do you suppose that is now, of all times?
From what I could gather, there are some cycles that sort of, especially in terms of our years, because obviously the years are relevant to the Earth rather than another planet somewhere.
Hmm.
For us, every 26,000 years, there seems to be like a wave comes through, which we can then ride like a surfer if we choose. Um, Another bigger wave comes in every 260,000 years, and another even huger wave comes in, that's the right phrase, every 260 million years. And at the moment, we seem to be the sort of a coinciding of all of those three waves. And at the 26,000 year point, it seems that it's an opportunity for individual souls to ascend from, in our case, would be the third to the fifth dimension. Um, a lot of this is laid out very clearly in the Wheels of Creation book. That they talk about having 12 dimensions, and that human existence is in and each dimension has 12 steps in it, if you like. A bit like having an octave in music. So you've got an
Right.
octave, and each octave's got the same notes in it, but there's slightly higher pitch each time.
And where did you say the humans are?
We're on the
We're on
third
the
step
third
of the
step.
third dimension. And our progression through the astral planes is going up through the fourth and the fifth and the sixth step.
So a lot of people say, and I hear this a lot, that we're at the third dimension and that we're all trying to get up to the fifth dimension, and the fourth dimension kind of gets skipped. And I keep thinking, well, hang on a minute, what happened in the fourth? What's there? Why is that sort of transgressed very quickly?
The only explanation I've come across, and I've asked the same question, and I'm really not sure, is that during the times of Atlantis, or people refer to something called the Fall, and the Fall seems to be a long time ago in our history, when the angelic beings on the planet decided to speed up the process of creation. Most things have got a balance between positive and negative spin, and they're kind of providing a bit like a magnet, providing they're in balance, that things keep moving. We need that kind of spin to have any progress. And they thought if they increased the positivity, took it out of balance from the negativity, they'd be able to revolve even faster. But what actually seemed to have happened is it then that process completely disconnected their channel through to source information. And they lost that completely. We still haven't got it back, apparently. So that seems to coincide with the Atlantis story and the playing around with energies and crystals and creating some kind of cataclysm. And it seems that human beings were living in the fourth dimension around that time. And because it was such a big disruption and caused such a sort of cataclysm, not just for us, but in the universe as well, the fourth dimension has been like it's like a page which says intentionally blank on it is being kept intentionally void of human life, and that's why we seem to be skipping from the
And
third.
what would it have been, the fourth dimension?
Um, Probably a place where we would still be physical, but probably be a bit less dense, where we'd certainly be much more telepathic than we are now. Um, Probably living a balance between this kind of promised land that people often speak about. Um, I think when they do that, they often talk about a much nicer version of what we've got. I think the fifth dimension is a completely different version of what we've got, and I think you know, to experience that would probably blow our minds a little bit. I think it's so different. So it's much more than a land of milk and honey. It's just a completely different place.
Mm.
But I think the fourth dimension might well have been that land of milk and honey, or certainly I've had aspects of it. And the way the dimensions work is the fourth dimension can be very aware of the third dimension, but the third dimension can't do that in reverse. So the sort of the awareness of the seventh dimension, we could do the sixth and the fifth and the fourth and the third, but the third,
Yes, I suppose like us, we can look down on ants and watch them quite happily, but they have no notion of what we are because we're so super big that it and probably move at a different speed, or the way they perceive the world is so vastly different that they can't go, oh, is that bloke again? He keeps treading on my mates.
yeah, that's probably a reasonable parallel. Um, so for some reason, I think the fourth dimension is there seems to have been a big accident there, and that's why I think it's not being used. Um,
Are people or spirits in the fourth dimension? Do you think is that a realm that is occupied, even though we might be aiming to skip it?
um, I think sometimes there's a confusion, and I'm not even sure I've got this straight, but um, I've got friends who are convinced that because we're multidimensional, we've already got part of our being living in the fifth dimension and part in the seventh, and so on. Um, I suspect that for most people, when they leave this life and go to the afterlife, what they're really doing is staying in the third dimension, but going into the astral planes of the third dimension. But there does seem to be, if I use the octave analogy again, you've got the note of A all the way through in each octave. There does seem to be a sort of resonance that can filter through. So the eighth step, say, in the third dimension will resonate with the eighth dimension, and the seventh step with the seventh dimension, and so on. And the eighth dimension is where the Akashic records are, where the record keeping is carried out. So when we want to access that, if we can connect with someone who's operating at the eighth step in our third dimension, they'll have a hotline through to the Akashic records and can bring that information back so we can do life planning and things. Makes sense. This is a vast subject, isn't it? And I'm kind of
I mean, well, yes, we can certainly talk about this for ages. I just have a quick look at see how long we've been going. Got about 9 minutes left if I can keep this to the hour.
sure.
One of the things, of course, people often say, and you've kind of covered this, I imagine, with the early process of the process of dying and what immediately happens afterwards, and the people hanging about for a bit in a less physical realm is the subject of ghosts. Of course, when people say, "I saw my mother or father sitting on the end of the bed," or walking in the doorway, they either looked at me and then disappeared, or they didn't look at me. Presumably that is that phase when the person's moved on, if it's fairly recently, and they're not quite fully evolved to the next stage.
I think there's several different types of ghost, if you like. So I think sometimes the idea that your grandparent comes to visit you when they've just passed over is probably someone in their etheric body, and the person is sensitive enough to perceive them, to recognize that they're there, and there's usually an attempt to reassure them that everything's okay. Another type would be the kind of memories or echoes that seem to be imprinted on the walls of old castles, or it's a bit like going into a church. I can feel an atmosphere there. There's a sort of
Mm.
sweetness to it. Well, imagine this sort of place where it's pretty violent and unpleasant. There would be an equivalent energy, and sometimes like replaying a video, I suppose. It just sort of people sort of see some images of the headless dog running across the road and things.
Mm.
The third category seems to be people who have managed to lose their etheric body, but haven't managed to integrate their emotional or mental bodies, their mind bodies. And sometimes it's because they're really attached to a place on the earth. Sometimes they're full of anger and they want to hate and be vengeful. And sometimes they just really can't drag themselves away from the idea that they're a human being on the earth. I think it's those energies that float around, and the kind of ghosts that most people would probably think of as ghosts. That makes sense.
Yeah. So if somebody doesn't want to be dragged away, maybe they are, they're in love very, very much with a partner or their children or even the castle or house that they live in. Do you think that they can choose to hang around, or that they have to carry on that journey?
I think they can choose to hang around, and of course, for them, that they haven't got the same concept of time that we have. From what I can.
Right.
So what may to us seem like hundreds of years might to them seem like a sort of blink. But eventually, I think they realise that. My brother, who's the medium, I remember doing some spirit rescue work to sort of try and encourage some of these lost souls to find their way back. And he came across this guy who'd been lying in his coffin for 100 years. And he assumed that when you died, he was going to lie in a coffin. So that's what he created for himself. And he just lay in his coffin and been lying in the darkness and the blackness for 100 years, sort of
Right. Not
wondering
getting
what it was all
bored.
about.
Twiddling one's thumbs. Hang on, this is it.
Which paints a lovely picture, doesn't it? But
Yeah.
so eventually, I think there'll be a guide hovering. It's a bit like the guides don't tend to interfere. They don't want to come in and dominate and tell you what to do. From what I can gather,
Mm.
what they want to do is inspire and nurture. And eventually, when they'll say, "Excuse me, we're interested in talking. And yeah, yeah, maybe. Well, have you thought about this?
So, I mean, one of the things that happened when my parents died, because up until then I was quite skeptical about pretty much all this sort of stuff. And I thought, well, this is the one time I can put this to the test. I knew people who had died, but they weren't so personally or closely related to me.
Mhm.
And I thought that either my father or my mother, but I thought more strongly my father for some reason, I can't say why that would be, would want to talk to me from the afterlife or from the next stage, whatever it is. And I have gone around the house, and I'm not, embarrassed to say this, and I've spoken out loud and welcomed them in,
Hmm.
but I've had absolutely zero response. And people say, well, perhaps they're not ready to come back, or all these sort of things. Um, and I and Julia will, my partner Julia will vouch for this. I say it is so frustrating because I talk to a number of spiritual people in this journey that I've had over the last 8 months doing the channel and interviewing people, and I say I am so nothing is off the table. You can give me the most weirdest and wackiest theory, and at the moment, because the world for me has turned 180 degrees, of everything I ever thought was true is now, pretty much a lie.
Yeah.
And then it's that business of, well, what is true? Even the new truths, I don't even know if they're true. So nothing's off the table. You could give me any sort of weird and wacky theory, and I'll allow it to be there. I'm not saying I will accept it fully as 100% truthful, but I'm not dismissing it. And I say it's very frustrating because I'm so up for the spiritual, contacting the higher self. I meditate. I'll open up whatever channel it may be to welcome anybody along. And of course, then I get emails if I mention this, I get people from the religious people saying, for goodness sake, don't do that because you don't know what you're going to encounter. But so far, nothing. And, and you just sit there going, this is not fair. So it is very frustrating because in my mind, I'm open to it. I have a friend who will walk into a room and go, oh, blimey, the atmosphere in here is heavy. And in the end, I just start thinking, all these people are making it up because I don't feel anything. And I desperately want to.
I I'm in a similar kind of place to you, really. The only way I can liken it's imagine having a radio, and unless you've got a long wave function on the radio, you can't listen into long wave radio stations, no matter how hard
Right.
you try. But there just seems to be something. The pineal gland seems to be have quite a lot to do with this. So I'm not sure how to develop it, or whether mine's been calcified and it's too late, or so I tend to rely more on mediums. I've had little experiences. I've been rocked a few times, and I've been working with people,
Oh, right.
and I could stop it. But if I just allowed myself just to be, I was found myself being sort of, pushed backwards and forwards quite distinctly. One of my brother's sessions, I felt squashed against the wall at one point, physically squashed against the wall, and I had this image of my nanny, who was my great grandmother, and she had quite a large bottom when she left the earth. Um, and I just had this picture of her laughing her head off and giggling, sitting on my lap and enjoying every moment of squashing me against the wall. So I've had little experiences like that. But yeah, the idea of seeing a sort of fully formed spirit walk into the room and have a conversation, I'd be delighted to do that. But it
Mm.
hasn't happened. My brother sees all kinds of stuff, but I don't.
No, it's very
It's very
infuriating.
frustrating.
Finally, because I better draw this to a conclusion, we started off saying that we were taking away the fear of death. I mean, I think a lot of people, regardless, still wonder or walk away from that moment or don't want to consider that moment of death because they associate it perhaps with a lot of pain and anguish. What can you say to make that less fearful?
I think in those moments of trauma or deep pain, I think sometimes there's a reason why we experience them so that we can understand what that feels like. But for most people, and I think this is the majority, I think the soul steps out of the body at that moment. So just before you're about to sort of smash into the wall in your car, the soul goes, uh-oh, and sort of
I'm
pops out.
out of here.
I'm out of here. And
Yeah.
actually, well, the body gets sort of broken up a little bit, but the soul doesn't have that experience of all the pain that goes with it.
Yes, because I mean, you think when you're born, I mean, I can't remember, of course. I say, of course. I can't remember the pain it must have been for a baby to be pushed out of her mother's uterus and all of that
Yeah.
through the birthing channel. It must have been, if not physically painful, because maybe the nervous system is not yet fully functional, I don't know, but it must be incredibly shocking for 1 minute being in your comfort blanket and your this
Hmm.
warm, beautiful existence with sort of diffused sound around and you're, it's just very nice, and then this sudden contraction going, oh my god, what's this all about? And of course some of it can be drawn out quite a long time and quite frightening. And so I suppose the 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 logic is that that's what it's like coming into the world. Going out of the world can be, apart from those lucky people that sort of die in their sleep very peacefully, could be um, quite grim. And but it's reassuring if you if the spirit is going, oh, I see what's about to happen. See ya, and makes a swift exit.
That's my sense of what happens. And of course, I can't know for sure. But as a general thing, and I'll finish on this one last thought really. Death, the physical death seems to be a much more pleasant, joyous process than birth. Seems much more traumatic, I think, as you just described.
Mm.
And Alice Bailey in the 30s said, we're coming to a time when we will celebrate death rather than mourn it. And we'll celebrate it as a relief from the restrictions and the strictures of physical form. I think
Well,
that's a nice way of thinking
yeah,
about it.
and actually, we all know that there are moments of joy, of course, and hopefully lots of moments in joy in life. But we also know that it's wrapped up in a whole load of pain and anguish and worry. A lot of it self-appointed.
Yeah.
That we get very wrapped up in certain things, and with a broad range of emotions which often aren't very helpful, anger and things like that. And then things that are completely out of our control, if you bash your arm or hit your funny bone, but worse if if you have accidents but you survive from, and you've got problems for the rest of your life, and chronic pain and things like that death, if there's something more than just this experience, it's free from that pain, and the mobility is there and what have you, it's got to be good, hasn't it?
Absolutely. I think we think of life as finishing at death, but actually, it's probably only just starting, or it's only a fraction of the way through. Um, the afterlife seems to be filled with care, nurture, realization. And as we come more to terms with the life we've led and start to accept it and understand it, we get room to explore. I think there's more learning goes on, or more understanding goes on in the afterlife than it does in this life. We can practice our music, we can explore anything we want. And I think there's a huge realm. When people talk about heaven, and I think eventually, once we've been through our life review and accepted, who we are at that point, then we enter a world where there is no resistance, there's no roughness. At that point, all the worries and the cares and the anxiety have completely gone, and we can just be free to explore and have fun. So I'm looking forward to mine. Not just
Well,
not just yet.
not just yet, though. There's always that caveat. Isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm looking for, but not today. Thanks very much. Very kind, Charlie. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you and share your thoughts and experiences on this very interesting subject, which, of course, as we said, everybody's going to at some point experience. Do you have a website? You write books, or is there anything that people can find out more about what you do?
Um, I live on the Welsh Shropshire border, about halfway up. off White Wales. And we're just about to start running our own workshops. And the idea is to bring people in to share their spiritual stories in a group so that like they can expand their awareness. So some people will be great at healing, others will be great at mediumship. Some may talk about other things, but if we can share those stories, then we can sort of stretch the spiritual boundaries. Um, for me, it's a bit like I've got a sort of cosmic map. And as I get a better piece of information, I throw out the old jigsaw piece and put a new piece in. So it's constantly moving, but I love the idea of it growing. And for me, it's fascinating. So I wanted to offer that to other people. And then if we can, we're going to run some ceremonies to get people to connect to their higher selves as best they can and provide space for some contemplation so that it's something you alluded to earlier, getting a sense of their life purpose, but not just from their current perspective, but from a higher perspective. And it might look different. So that's what we're going
Right.
to do. The website is it's not quite up yet, but it will be starfishspace.org.
Starfish. I'll write that down in a minute. Space.org. I'll put the link in the description and then just keep coming back. Presumably people can until it's up and running. I mean, people may watch this
Not a
video.
month or so yet, but
Yeah. So this is going out in the beginning of August. If you're watching this in September or any other time of the year, hopefully it will be there. Charlie, thank you so much for joining me and talking about this interesting subject. I'd be fascinated to see the comments because, I mean, apart from those people who are very sceptical, of course, those people who've experienced some interesting experiences, it would be interesting if you share them. It'd be thrilling to read what other people make of all of this. Thank you very much, Charlie.
Thank you too, Richard. It's been great. Lovely.
So there you go. I hope you've got something out of this. Be interesting, as I say, to read your comments, but we must finish now. Thank you again to Charlie, and from me, it's goodbye, and I'll be back again with more interviews and monologues and bits and bobs on the channel. Till then, from us both, goodbye.